So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hi there, YouTube. The Dapper Dinosaur here. Yet again, with some fresh creationist nonsense. Or rather, like, year-old creationist nonsense? But then again, it's not like they update their talking points more than once every few decades, no matter how wrong they are. So, I guess it doesn't really matter all that much. Anyway, we're going to take a look at a talk given by Andrew Snelling at the Creation Museum. Before that, I want to ask all of you to please like this video and subscribe to this channel. YouTube is a very fickle thing, and the only way for this channel to grow is if viewers like you help it. Anyway, here's Ken Ham saying stuff before he lets Snelling get on with it.
Thanks for joining us in Legacy Hall to hear from my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Andrew Snelling. As you'll be able to tell from his lack of an American accent, Dr. Snelling comes from down under, just like me. He's a geologist and research scientist with a PhD in geology from the University of Sydney in Australia.
He is, and the funny thing about that is that he's a geologist who publishes completely ordinary science in peer-reviewed venues, where he doesn't espouse any kind of young Earth creationist stuff. Then he turns around and contradicts himself in creationist venues. He also just blatantly lies about rocks for creationists, so congrats on getting a PhD geologist, Ken, but I guess we know which of the three among honest, well-informed, and creationist you went with. This time it's well-informed, creationist, but not honest. Because remember, you can't be all three.
He's worked in exploration and mining industries all across Australia before starting in full-time creation ministry and research. Dr. Snelling now serves as Director for the Answers in Genesis Research Department. He's also a popular speaker and author. You can find his resources, including his monumental work, Earth's Catastrophic Past, in our bookstore.
Lying to the willingly ignorant is a lot easier than actually producing results useful to the mining industry, which, has to actually hit deposits and can't rely on fantastical nonsense, like Ken Ham's ministry can.
At this time, please silence all cell phones and note that emergency exits are located up front, to your right and left, and along the left side of the room.
This is YouTube. Keep your cell phones on if you want. But also, thanks for telling me where to go if I need to run screaming from this video, Ken.
Now, let's give our full attention and a warm welcome to my Aussie friend, Dr. Andrew Snelling.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. As Ken said, we've known one another for quite a long time. I first met Ken 40 years ago, and we've worked together for coming on 35 years now. What I want to talk about this afternoon is fossils and rock layers, the flood, not evolution, and millions of years.
I'll give Answers in Genesis props for this much. At least they actually have a PhD in geology giving their geology talk, instead of like a PhD in genetics like Georgia Purdom, or a PhD in astrophysics like Jason Lyle. Often they have people completely outside of their own field. That being said, at least then I can pretend that the speakers are simply ill-informed rather than dishonest. I won't have that luxury here.
Now we get presented in the museums and in textbooks this diagram that you can see on the screen. And many people are confused. Does that represent reality? Do we find rock layers stacked up like that? Do we find the fossils in that particular order? What about the labels on those rock layers? Are they for real? Can we trust what we see in the textbooks and in the museums? What is fact and what is fiction?
As a rule of thumb, you can generally be pretty confident that if there is a broad scientific consensus on a particular topic, that consensus is at least mostly correct.
And so I want to answer to begin with these questions. Is the rock and fossil sequence real, or is it simply contrived to make it support evolution and millions of years?
So the evidence for the age of various rock layers, their general sequence, and even the fossils found in them, in no way depend on evolution. In fact, before evolution was even proposed, geologists were working this out. And while they could only give vague estimates of the age of the Earth based on how long it would take to simply deposit the rocks that are extant, they still knew that an age of only some 10,000 years or so was completely out of the question as being far, far too young. The fact that evolutionary theory and geology are concordant isn't a conspiracy. It's a result of our models of geology and our models of biology being largely correct.
Does it show evolution in the development of life through this so-called geologic column?
Yes, although not with nearly as much detail as we'd like, but far more than we could expect.
And does it date the rocks as millions of years old according to the geologic timescale?
No, the rocks and fossils per se do not date themselves. People have to do that. And when they do, we know for a fact that the Earth is not thousands of years old, it's billions of years old. And that much of the rock is hundreds of thousands or more years old.
Many of you will be familiar with those terms and those terminology. You see these diagrams in museums and textbooks that life has supposedly developed from the first chemicals that produced the first cell that diverged through time over millions of years, branching into all different organisms that we see today.
Well, the fossils do help us with some of that, but the evidence connecting plants and animals is primarily molecular, not fossil. However, within plants and animals, we do in fact have a lot of wonderful transitional forms linking major groups of organisms within those kingdoms.
And you see this diagram and references to the Paleozoic and the Permian and the Carboniferous and all these names that are supposed to represent a geological timescale representing millions of years for the development of life on Earth. So these are the issues we want to come face to face with this afternoon. I'm going to shock you by first of all telling you that the rock layers are real.
I mean, good. You can literally just go walk outside in many areas of the world and have a look at them. So at least Snelling has that right.
Now, the other interesting thing is that the local rock sequences, so for example, you can drive all around Cincinnati and you can see that there's some variations where you go up and down, that there is a sequence of rock layers in this area. Well, they generally follow, the local rock sequences generally follow the order that's depicted in the geologic column.
Yep, because shockingly, the geological column wasn't described as part of a conspiracy to get everyone to stop believing in God. It was just the result of looking at the data and going where they lead.
And so the layers here in Cincinnati, you can compare with layers in other parts of the world, in exactly the same section of the geologic column it seems to fit. In fact, the local rock sequences can be connected together across regions and continents in much the same order as the geologic column.
Yep, that's one of the reasons we know about ancient supercontinents.
So, for example, we can go northeast from here up to Cedar Creek State Park and look at the rock layers that are slightly higher in the sequence. You know, we can trace those all the way to Niagara Falls.
So far, Snelling is doing pretty well.
We can go south down the 75 and we go up the sequence as well, and we can trace those layers, and I'm going to give you some examples shortly. And the other interesting thing is the fossils contained in the rock sequences generally follow the order of the fossil record. Now that might surprise you. Well, it shouldn't, because it's not fabricated when they do those diagrams.
Weird, right? Scientists aren't just lying to you and each other. But why do I feel like there's a but coming?
But,
I knew it.
The caveat is, in those diagrams, they don't show you all the fossils that are found in the rock layers.
I mean, yeah, you couldn't fit detailed pictures of every paleotaxon found in any given sequence of rock. This is like supposed to be a poster or even a page in a textbook, not a mural spanning a whole room. I'm going to say that unless Dr. Snelling can manage to show every single fossil taxon known at the time of this recording in his presentation, then he's just being dishonest in this criticism. And the thing is, I don't really think that it's a criticism he's trying to make. I think he's just being sloppy. I suspect that what he's actually trying to say here is that there are some selected taxa that are typically excluded from such pictures because in his mind they show some kind of problem for the theory of evolution or the great age of the Earth. But if that's what's going on here, he should have said that.
They choose the ones that tell the supposed story of evolutionary development.
No, they pick the ones that are generally popular with their audience and that are stereotypical of the given rock system and therefore paleo environment.
If you take into account all the fossils that are found in each and every rock layer, they tell a different story. But we'll come to that in a moment.
Different than what? The scientific consensus? Because that consensus is built upon what is found in the rocks, as Snelling has already pointed out.
First of all, let's journey out to the southwestern United States, to the Grand Canyon area.
A place I've been to a few times, just a few months ago most recently, where I was joined by some fellow counter-creationists like R.J. Downard. I even got my copy of The Rocks Were There signed by him. Now to get Jackson Wheat out to the Grand Canyon so I can make him sign it too.
Why do we go to the Grand Canyon? Why is it such a good place? Well, to put it bluntly, the biology doesn't cover up the geology because it's a desert. So the rock layers are exposed to view, and it's a slice through the rock layers that you don't find anywhere else in the world.
Well, there are other canyons and exposures, but the Grand Canyon is especially dramatic, and the rock layers there are especially obvious, even to casual observers. And if you didn't notice them, just stop in at basically any visitor center in the park, they'll be sure to tell you about the layers. But do bring a mask, because as of the time of this recording, and to the best of my knowledge, masks are required inside all the buildings on the park, with the exception of inside hotel rooms, dining areas, and private dwellings.
Not only have you got the Grand Canyon, but you go northwards from the Grand Canyon, up a series of cliffs like a giant staircase. In fact, it's called the giant staircase.
Well, it's called the Grand Staircase, but that just means the big staircase, so okay.
You eventually climb up to the Zion Canyon area, and you go a little bit higher up to Bryce Canyon. You've actually climbed from the bottom of the Grand Canyon to the top of Bryce Canyon. You've climbed through 15,000 feet of rock layers containing fossils. Well, here they are. This is a view in the western Grand Canyon, where you can see the narrowest part of the Colorado River right there. It's called Granite Narrows. And down there is the crystalline basement rocks that we believe match what we would expect from the description in Genesis of what happened during the creation week. And then we've got a few layers stacked on top of that don't have any fossils in them. They probably represent pre-flood sedimentary layers because there was erosion and sedimentation in the pre-flood world.
But even your so-called pre-flood rocks show signs of things like metamorphic change in the Vishnu cyst. And pre-flood or not, the sedimentary rocks of the Supai supergroup should still have fossils if they were formed when macroscopic life was abundant, which is the claim of creationists. Even without animal death or something like that, we should still expect to see things like trilobite sheds, pollen, leaves, etc., all of which readily fossilize and are common in environments with those organisms. As apparently this was, again according to the creationists, so the lack of fossils in the supergroup rocks is actually a major problem for flood geology.
But then we come to an erosion surface, and above that erosion surface, which marks the onset of the flood, you've got all these layers in the walls of the canyon that contain all these fossils.
Nothing about the Great Unconformity indicates that it was the start of a flood. For one thing, floods don't cause the uplift, evident in the basement rocks and supergroup rocks. So you're going to need something else to explain why they were uplifted. But the erosion at the Great Unconformity is in fact an open question in science, and Snelling has not solved it by simply proclaiming, the flood did it.
And so they're the flood layers.
Except we have things like limestone and subaerial sandstone, which, can't form in a flood. Further, we have fine-grained shale in these rocks, without flocculation, which again, can't form in a flood. Even the conglomerates of the Grand Canyon aren't graded, so they're unlikely to be the result of a flood, and the conglomerates would be your best bet for flood-caused rocks.
Well, that's the western Grand Canyon. Let's go to the beginning of the Grand Canyon, to where we actually launch on our raft trips. We're right there at river level. You can see the rock layer that is normally you find at the top of the Grand Canyon. So we've actually gone upstream, up through the layers, and we're back now at river level. We're at the level you'd normally be at the top of the Grand Canyon. And we can look northwards and we start to see these other cliffs that make up the giant staircase. We've got the Chocolate Cliffs, we've got the Vermilion Cliffs. We go even further and we go to Mount Zion, to Zion Canyon, and we've got the White Cliffs. And finally you go higher up, you get to the Pink Cliffs. So as I said, at Bryce Canyon. So as I said, you can actually climb from the bottom of the Grand Canyon through 15,000 feet, almost 3 miles thickness of rock layers containing fossils.
Let's hope there's a point to this.
That are the record of the flood, from our perspective.
So that whole thing was just a setup to what you believe about geology? Okay, I hope there's something to back that up.
So the layers are real, and the sequence is real. What about the fossils we find in this sequence? Well, we start in the pre-flood rocks, those sedimentary rocks. They don't have any major fossils. They have microfossils and algae and trace fossils.
But why is that? Those sedimentary rocks should preserve some things that are easy to preserve. Let's take trilobites as an example. The neat thing about trilobites is that their exoskeleton was mineralized, unlike what you'd see in an insect. Instead of being basically just chitin, they were mostly calcite and calcium phosphate held in a lattice of chitin. This means that chemically they were very similar to your bones, although not identical. This means that these shells are basically pre-fossilized, rather like a clamshell. Further, unlike with bivalves, trilobites had to shed their shells in life. Like all arthropods, trilobites couldn't grow while their exoskeleton was hard, so periodically they shed it. At this point, they would expand their size, probably in about the same way as a lobster, that is, by taking in water and essentially inflating themselves like a balloon. Then the new exoskeleton would harden and they would grow into it. This results in a ready-made fossil exoskeleton that has essentially no nutritional value, so it's very unlikely to be scavenged, and it's also already basically a rock, so it doesn't need any special preservation to occur for it to be found in the fossil record. So any sedimentation happening in an area with trilobites living in it is basically guaranteed to preserve some shed exoskeletons, and that's one of the reasons why shed trilobite carapaces are one of the most common fossils anywhere where Paleozoic rocks are exposed. So why is it that the Bass limestone and the Dock sandstone, which are according to Snelling pre-flood deposits laid down by the same kinds of forces we see operating today, have no trilobite fossils? He says that trilobites were alive at the time. Similarly, in the Dock sandstone we would expect at least some plant fossils, since some of the deposits are from rivers and estuaries, and plants shed leaves, spores, seeds, pollen, etc. And according to Snelling, there were fully developed and thriving ecosystems before the flood.
The kind of thing that you would expect from life that was crawling around in the pre-flood world. There weren't the conditions in the pre-flood world that would have fossilized elephants or dinosaurs, because they're big creatures and you need catastrophic conditions to bury them en masse.
En masse? Yes. At all? No. But like I just said, we do have the conditions needed for lots of fossils that we should find, even if we accept Snelling's implication that floods are needed to preserve larger organisms.
It's only when you get to that line across the bottom there, which is the erosion surface that marks the beginning of the flood, we call it the Great Unconformity. It's a technical term for an erosion surface where everything just gets eroded off.
It's more than just an erosion surface. It's also a time gap, as indicated by the dating of the rocks involved. But I think Snelling may elsewhere get into why he rejects the science on the dates of rocks later and in more depth. So I'll save that discussion for later.
But then we get these layers which have all these fossils in them. And so initially we have trilobites and clams and sponges and echinoderms and gastropods or snails. And as we go up through the sequence of the Grand Canyon rock layers, we've only got marine fossils.
The Tepete sandstone is definitely not a flood deposit, and we've known this for decades. For one thing, it includes ichnofossils, that is, traces of ancient life that are not derived from the remains of ancient life, in the form of burrows. This alone precludes this from being a flood deposit, as one of the most important things about turbidite, which is what you get when rock is deposited by a flood, is that it erases any signs of bioturbation, such as burrows, tracks, etc. Further, the cross-bending grain size and facies sequence of the tapetes are completely in line with modern depositional environments, such as a shallow marine tidal area, then upstream some estuaries, then farther upstream braided streams. In order to suggest instead is a flood deposit, we would need to show how a flood could deposit something that has for decades been known to be concordant with shallow, fresh, and saltwater environments with tidal deposition, even could be laid down in a flood. And spoiler alert, it can't be. Instead, the only reasonable interpretation is to include that it was formed in the way that it appears based on the deposition we can watch now, that is, in a shallow marine and coastal freshwater area. I want to be clear here. Saying the Tepete sandstone is a flood deposit sounds to anyone who knows anything about geology about as reasonable as saying it's made of cotton candy. It's absurd on the face of it, and it flies in the face of all reason and evidence. Andrew Snelling knows this. He is lying to you.
We've only got marine fossils apart from some tracks of vertebrate animals. I'll show you those in a moment too. Now, as we go northwards up the grand staircase, what do we find? We find, we start to get not only clams, but we start to get terrestrial animals. They're bones. And we're getting a mixture of fresh and water and marine creatures, which you'd expect as the flood came up onto the land. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But we increasingly get land fossils as the waters cover the land.
So the thing here is that Snelling is kind of right about what a flood should do. He's just wrong that that's what we see in the rock layers. You see, a couple years ago, in 2019, a fossil bed was described by scientists, including Walter Alvarez. The son of the father-son team that first proposed the Yucatan impact site was the cause of the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. That seems to have been caused by the very same impact. And this is not just a flood deposit, but it's a flood caused by a tsunami, which is the kind of thing young Earth creationists envision in their ideas about the flood. So this is exactly the kind of thing that we should expect to see from such an event. First, there are no ichnofossils or signs of bioturbation. Second, the animals include a strange mix of coastal marine and freshwater organisms, along with a lot of debris and land animals. But that mix of marine and freshwater is important. You see, the marine creatures were swept up onto higher ground, but in the formations that Snelling is describing, we frequently do not have marine organisms mixed in. Instead, we get freshwater life, as Snelling put on his slide, such as in the Chinle Formation and the Moanav Formation. If this were a flood sweeping organisms up from the depths, then we should expect marine life all through these layers. We don't find that. Now you might ask why the fish and land animals are mixed together. Well, it's simply because when things die, sometimes they fall into water, even if they don't live there. And most of these deposits were made by water, in the case of the Chinle, for example, by braided streams. Interestingly, Snelling doesn't bother to include the Coconino sandstone in this list, and that wasn't even formed by water, but by wind in an arid desert.
And so that sequence is exactly the same as what we find in that diagram.
Well, yeah, both lists are based on the fossils noted in those formations. But also remember, when Snelling complained about the first list he showed not telling us about all the fossils, well, he didn't do so either. Why the double standard? Is it because if it weren't for double standards, creationists wouldn't have any at all?
If you look at that diagram, the middle column there, you'll see drawings at the bottom of marine life, and it's only higher up do you get the animal life.
That bottom row had Dickinsonia, an Ediacaran animal. There are animals all through the chart. What in the world is Snelling smoking? Just because it doesn't have fins or teeth doesn't mean you don't have an animal on your hands.
And so it does fit the general order. What we find in the Grand Canyon, Grand Staircase areas does fit the order that we see depicted in this diagram.
Which, interestingly, also fits evolutionary predictions and doesn't fit into what a flood would do.
So, how should we respond to this information? Because after all, God doesn't lie.
God might not lie, but Andrew Snelling sure does.
So if the rock sequences and fossils rock sequences and fossil record are real, how can we explain them? Now, of course, we have to start with God's word because it's our authority. God was there, he created, and he's recorded for us the true history of the earth.
No, that's not what we should do. Look, the physical universe predates the Bible, and the Bible's existence is contingent upon the physical universe. If anything in the universe contradicts your reading of the Bible, then either you're reading it wrong or the Bible is wrong. So when you go to examine the world in a scientific manner, you might as well toss out the Bible, because it's irrelevant. And you know what? In his actual science, that's what Snelling does. He knows that the Bible is irrelevant to any geological inquiry. In fact, it's irrelevant to most research, except research on the Bible itself. If you're going to start off with the Bible with the unstated assumption that your interpretation is correct, then you're starting off with no way to know if you're wrong. And you're starting off with a conclusion and forcing the facts to fit it. That is the opposite of science. Good science takes you where the data lead. It does not lead the data to your pet hypothesis. That's just dishonest.
The Bible is God's history book of the universe. In fact, the reality is it's his story. What do I mean by that? It's all about Jesus Christ. It starts with Jesus as the creator, and in the middle you've got Jesus as the redeemer, and at the end you've got Jesus the coming king.
Cool story, bro, but guess what? If Jesus created the universe, he did it 13.77 billion years ago, and if he's king, it's over a planet where life evolved and humans are apes. I don't really care to argue about what the Bible is about, but no matter what it's about, it's not something you can glean a literal history of the universe from. And if you try, you'll end up being wrong, and perhaps, as is the case with Andrew Snelling, you'll start lying for Jesus. Because to you, having people believe in Jesus because you lie to them is more important than your own integrity. He then spends an inordinate amount of time just telling us what the Bible says according to his interpretation. I already know this, you already know this, I'm not including it. However, I had to listen to it, and it was infuriatingly long-winded and pointless.
The secular time scale says, no, man is only a late arrival. The universe began 13.7 billion years ago. The earth formed 4.5 billion years ago.
When he says secular, what he means is evidence-based science, and not theological book club, because that's how he has admitted he's coming to his conclusion. Not based on evidence, but based on the word of man, because that's what the Bible is, even if it's also inspired. On the other hand, the physical universe, if it was created by God, has to be his actual word, because no humans made it. So, whether there's a God or not, evidence is how we should find out about the world, and we shouldn't let any book convince us of what is evidently untrue. Either find a new way to read that book, or stop taking it seriously. And I want to point out that a lot of people who take the Bible quite seriously are not young earth creationists, or in any other way contradicting science.
It was a hot molten blob. Well, they're wrong, because God said when he created it was covered in water, it was cool, it wasn't hot.
No, if they're wrong, it would not be because the Bible said so. It would be because the evidence shows that the earth was a cool lump of rock covered in water. The evidence does not indicate that.
And the Bible says the earth was created first, not the sun.
Then we would find that when we check the age of the earth against that of other things in the solar system, we'd find that it's older via things like radiometric dating. Instead, we find that this whole solar system formed about at the same time, around 4.5 billion years ago. That's just what the evidence says. Sorry if your interpretation of the Bible disagrees with the hard facts of science, but there it is. Not all religious beliefs are tenable.
The scientists say the sun was first and the earth later, so who's right? God was there, the scientists weren't.
I mean, kinda. The protostar that was to become the sun did start being identifiable before the earth started to form, but at this point, everything is just kind of forming together around the same time. But if God was there, he evidently didn't feel like it was important to get an accurate record of the formation of the solar system into his word. Unless you want to say that he did, but he also arranged everything to look exactly as if it formed the way science says it did. That seems a bit dishonest of him, to say the least. After this, Snelling rants again for almost 2 minutes about his theology. Again, I don't care, so I cut it out.
So what do we find in the fossil record? Is the fossil record a record of life?
By definition, fossils are traces of ancient life, so yes, fossils are traces of life. The collection of all extant fossils is the fossil record. Fossils exist, therefore the fossil record is a record of life.
Ha! That's a record of death.
You can't record death without also recording life. As far as we can tell, you can't record life for a very long time without also recording death. They are two sides of the same biological coin. I don't mean to start an existential crisis here, but as far as we can tell, death is one of the most certain things about life.
You see living things crawling around in the rocks? No, you see dead things.
Actually, you see both. That's why when you're doing chemical tests on fossils, you have to be careful of contamination by recent organisms.
And you see evidence of carnivory.
Turns out that animals are full of nutrients and are easy to digest, so of course you see carnivory going all the way back to the Cambrian fossils.
Animals eating animals. We see evidence of cancer, broken teeth, fractures that are healed, so there was violence.
I'm sorry, so is he saying that before the fall, bones were infinitely strong? So if a human fell out of a tree, they wouldn't ever have broken a wrist? Talk about eisegesis.
We also find fossilized thorns in the fossil record that are claimed to be 400 million years old. Now, but wait a minute. The Bible has a specific statement about thorns. When did thorns come into existence? Did God create thorns initially? No. Thorns came as a result of the curse after Adam and Eve sinned. So that means thorns couldn't precede Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Again, cool story, bro, but the thorns are 400 million years old, and saying the Bible contradicts that means literally nothing to the claim.
Adam and Eve couldn't have been walking on a fossil graveyard in the Garden of Eden because that would be a record of death and destruction before they arrived.
In the creation myth of Genesis, sure, but Snelling is supposed to be a geologist. And the way that geology definitely does not work is by throwing out all evidence in order to make an ancient myth literal history.
But that's what the secularists say. You see, we know they are wrong because thorns are specifically mentioned in Scripture. They come after Adam and Eve sinned, so they can't be millions and millions of years old. You see, there's a radically different view of the world.
Then the only sane thing to conclude is that Adam and Eve did not literally exist as described in Genesis. Any other conclusion, knowing what Snelling knows, is intellectually dishonest.
The secularists say, no, death and disease and suffering and bloodshed brought you and I into existence. Nature red in tooth and claw. But the Bible says, no, it was man who sinned that brought death.
Anytime he says secularist, remember that what he means is people who care about evidence.
So how do we explain the fossils? If Adam and Eve weren't walking on a fossil graveyard in the Garden of Eden because God had created a very good world to begin with, so there couldn't be dead dinosaurs under their feet. When did the dinosaurs die? Well, there was a catastrophe. See, that's the significance of the flood.
Look, man, I actually think the death connection to immoral behavior is cool. It underlines the importance of moral action and avoiding morally reprehensible action. You see, someone could look at the Bible and come away with a sense of how serious morality is. Or could look at it and come away believing crazy things like that thorns didn't exist millions of years ago, despite the evidence of millions of years old thorns. And let's not forget, Dr. Snelling has not actually given us our reason beyond Bible to say that these thorns are not as old as the evidence indicates.
So, if the flood really occurred, what evidence would you and I expect to find? It's a logical question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And what we should expect is probably an unconformity that is global in scale, followed by a global turbidite deposit combining organisms from all ecosystems sorted by hydrological principles, and for this deposit to be highly graded and quite extensive vertically. Why would we expect that? Well, because that's what floods leave behind. And if it happened everywhere, it would be left behind everywhere. Of course, after this, instead of giving us an answer, he just tells us to answer questions with questions.
All flesh died. Wouldn't you expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down all over the earth? And that's exactly what we find.
But just having lots of fossils doesn't actually indicate whether science or creationism is right. Both predict finding fossils. You have to look at the areas where there is disagreement in the predictions in order to differentiate between the two.
70% of the earth is covered of the continents is covered in fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks laid down by water.
But what about fossil-bearing rock laid down by air, like the Coconino Sandstone, the Dakota Formation in Mongolia, or the Ashfall fossil beds in Nebraska? They weren't formed by a flood, not even by water.
But how do you get a fossil fish in the first place?
A fish dies and is covered by sediment faster than it can rot away. Then over time, the organic tissues may be replaced by minerals which keep the shape of the original fish. Note though that in some environments, rotting is extremely slow, like in bodies of water with anoxic conditions at the bottom, which means that even quite slow sedimentation deposition can be fast enough to create a fossil.
Look at the beautiful state of preservation of that fish. Well, here's a fish about to have his breakfast, doesn't get time to swallow it before he's buried and fossilised. You get the point?
Nothing about that fossils requires the fish to have been buried alive. Fish today die from trying to swallow things that they can't really fit in their throat or that are too sharp. Nothing here implies a flood.
You can't preserve a fossil like that where he's just about to take a chomp and he's frozen in an instant.
Well, first, that isn't what had to have happened to form that fossil, and realizing that isn't even something that takes expertise. Just basic logic will get you there. That wasn't a fish about to take a bite. It tried to bite off more than it could handle. It may in fact have died rather slowly, and probably in some significant distress.
That's a marine reptile, 6 feet long, giving birth to a baby.
First, kudos to Snelling for getting it right that this is a reptile. Kent Hovind seems to think it's some kind of ray-fin fish, because he's an idiot. Second, that's certainly a baby exiting the mother's reproductive system, but it's not clear that this is an instance of live birth. It could instead be coffin birth. Coffin birth is known in many animals, humans included. When a pregnant female dies, decay gases can build up in the womb, which then pushes the infant out of the reproductive tract as the gas escapes into the environment. It's not clear if that is what happened here, but Snelling simply ignores that possibility.
1 minute, mother is about to give birth to a baby. Split second later, she's buried in tons and tons of mud.
Creationists do love this specimen, in part I think because it's nearly impossible to track down scholarly publications on it. I do think I've managed to find a publication describing the fossil. Unfortunately, it seems to be a book in German with no digitized edition. Fortunately though, it seems to be a German specimen of Stenopterygius, an early Jurassic ichthyosaur. Given that I managed to find numerous papers describing locations in Germany for such fossils, but not for this specific specimen, I think I can say a thing or two about it. Turns out that they are all from the Posidonia shale in southwest Germany. That shale is a bit coarser than others, but shows no signs of flocculation, or at least I couldn't find a single paper mentioning floccules in that deposit. And so while it was probably deposited faster than, say, the Bright Angel shale, it still probably took a long time to deposit overall. So no, this fossil was not buried rapidly because the rock it was found in couldn't have been deposited quickly. In other words, Snelling is once again lying about tons of mud, since, that'd be mudstone and not shale. And I remind you, this man is a geologist.
Fossilisation had to be catastrophic, virtually instant and rapid.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
Here's a fossilised jellyfish. Jellyfish are soft. They melt in the sun or get ripped apart by the wind and the waves.
Oh, so now I have to take back the kudos I gave Andrew here for getting it right that the fossil was a reptile. Because this is an Ediacaran trace fossil called Malsonite spriggi. No one knows for sure what it is, and it's not the body of an organism. It's more likely a holdfast or burrow. Of all the proposed identities for this fossil, jellyfish is the least well supported. I also want to note that this is from rock that Snelling himself says shouldn't have fossils at all. Think about that. He went to all these lengths to tell us that the flood starts at the beginning of the Paleozoic rock systems, and that we don't have much in the way of fossils besides trace fossils and microbes before that. Yet here we are with what he thinks is an animal fossil that requires rapid burial, except it's in rock that he says wasn't laid down catastrophically. And of course, this wasn't laid down catastrophically. It was in a sequence of some 27 vertical beds of coarse-grained feldspathic sandstone that preserves in-situ ecosystems with multiple generations. It isn't turbidite. That particular fossil was described in 1966 by Martin F. Glassner and is from the Nilpa fossil site in South Australia, in case anyone cares. Link in the description.
Or these crinoids. Look at the heads of those crinoids or coelides. They're delicate. They have been preserved.
You notice how he doesn't actually tell us where these fossils were found so we can check the sedimentology ourselves? Because I sure have noticed that. Weird, isn't it? It's almost like he knows he's full of it and doesn't want to let his audience in on it. Well, this time it worked. I couldn't find that specimen like I did with that almost certainly not a jellyfish. So instead, I'm going to simply use that specimen as a proxy for crinoid specimens generally. So for those who don't know, crinoids are echinoderms, along with sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, etc. And you'll probably not be surprised to learn that there is also a nickname for crinoids, with the word sea in it. They are called sea lilies, even though they are not plants, but animals. Now, just a month ago, as of this writing, I was at the Grand Canyon with some people from the internet land. One of the easiest rock formations of the canyon to see is the Red Wall Limestone, an 800-foot sheer cliff of red limestone. And guess what? It has crinoid fossils in it. And the problem with limestone is that flood conditions basically preclude the formation of limestone. Limestone forms fastest under calm, warm, low-pressure, low-acidity water. You know what that sounds like? It's the opposite of a flood. And even if the flood were calm, warm, which I guess it sure would be, since, no one has solved the heat problem, low pressure and non-acidic, giving limestone its best possible chance to deposit, it would still take nearly 5,000 years at optimal conditions to form the Red Wall limestone. And let's not forget that it's also in the middle of the canyon, which makes no sense, since the calcium carbonate that the limestone is made up of has no reason to selectively come out of solution only in the middle of the flood. For an even deeper dive, see the video linked above by Gutsick Gibbon, who will serve up more than 20 minutes of why limestone doesn't work in a flood.
Or the wings of this wasp. How do you fossilize a wasp like that if it's not rapidly and catastrophically buried?
Interestingly, this specimen is literally the first thing that shows up on a Google image search for the term fossil wasp. It's a specimen of Paleovespa florescentia, which is found in the Florissant Formation of Teller County, Colorado, hence the name. While that formation is known for a potential few flood rock layers, and some of it probably resulted from a lahar, which is a violent mudflow, this fossil seems to be from the shale portions of the formation based on the very fine grains, although I will be honest, I was unable to track down a source describing the exact location in which this particular fossil was found. But here's the interesting bit. This fossil is from Oligocene rocks, which according to Answers in Genesis, and therefore Snelling, is post-flood rock. So in order to convince us that only the Genesis flood could create such fossils, he's showing us a fossil that according to him could not possibly have formed in the flood, because when it formed, the flood was over. So far, of the 3 fossils he's shown us in this section, only one of them is actually even from rock that he would say is flood rock. It's almost like he didn't bother to research any of these specimens and just googled fossil wasp and went with the first image, because at the cost of repeating myself, this is the fossil you get as the first result when you do that.
Or flowers. These are soft organisms that would not be preserved. I mean, you get a flower today and leave it out, what's going to happen to it? It's going to wither, die, and fall apart. No, to preserve these organisms, you need rapid, catastrophic deposition on a mass scale.
This specimen was the 23rd result on a Google image search for a fossil flower. It's an unidentified flower from the Green River Formation, and it's unidentified precisely because, as Snelling said about plants, it has fallen apart, and important identifying parts of the flower are gone. Another interesting thing about the Green River Formation is that it has such regular and cyclic depositions that tiny variations in the orbit of the Earth can be detected in it. Good luck with that during a 1-year flood. But also, once again, this is from rock that Snelling doesn't consider flood rock. So 3 out of 4 of the examples of fossils that could only be formed during the flood of Noah were not formed during it, even according to Snelling. At this point, I expect that in order to convince you that Snelling only used homegrown vegetables at home, he'd hand you a bunch of cucumbers that all still have the supermarket sticker on them. The very examples he's giving refute his main point unless Answers in Genesis wants to move their flood boundary. But given their long-standing feud with the Institute for Creation Research over this very bone of contention, I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon.
So, what do the fossils show?
Well, these fossils show that Snelling is either a liar, unbelievably lazy, or a moron. I'm not completely sure which one, but I'm leaning towards both liar and unbelievably lazy.
They show evidence of death, disease, and destruction.
That's true.
They show evidence of rapid burial in a catastrophe, the flood. They also show evidence of sudden appearance, fully formed and complex, without any ancestors in the layers beneath them.
Okay, well let's look at that. For the first fossil that Snelling pretends is a jelly, but almost certainly is not, we don't know enough about it to say what its ancestors would be, since we really have no idea what it is. But let's look at the crinoid. As I've stated, crinoids are echinoderms, and interestingly, while they, along with all extant echinoderms, show radial symmetry, they all develop from bilaterally symmetrical larvae, and genetically they are actually closer to vertebrates than they are to animals like mollusks or insects. And all of those groups are bilaterally symmetrical. So if evolution is true, then echinoderms evolved from something that was bilaterally symmetrical as an adult, and so we should expect to see some very early bilaterally symmetrical echinoderms in the fossil record. What do you know? But that we do find them in the Cambrian. Animals such as Protoctinus mensellianus, Tenocytus utaensis, and Tenoimbricata spinosa. Probably mangled some of those. But they're all from the Cambrian. Weird how the exact morphological intermediates expected if evolution were true is exactly what we find, even though Snelling said we shouldn't find them. Okay, let's look at the wasp. Well, this one is fairly easy. That wasp was found in the Cenozoic, but way back at the beginning of the Mesozoic, in the Triassic period, we find the first species of wasp in Xylidae, the most basal hymenopterans around. You would barely recognize them as wasps, and they are not usually even called wasps, but sawflies, even though they are not true flies. And within Hymenoptera, we have both genetic, morphological, and fossil data that tells us all we really need to know about the evolution of sawflies, wasps, bees, and ants. We have lots of ancestral forms for the paper wasp that Snelling showed us. Well, now we're on to the flower. So flowers presumably evolved from non-flowering plants, so we should expect our earliest flowering plants to not really have full flowers. And what do you know? The early Cretaceous plant, Archifructus, has carpels and stamens, the reproductive organs, simply on the end of long stems with no petals or sepals to protect them or attract pollinators. Weird how before we get the first widespread flowering plants towards the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Paleogene, we get things that have only the most basic parts of a flower and have yet to actually develop all the fancy bits you or I would associate with flowers. It's almost like flowers do have evolutionary ancestors in the fossil record, and Andrew Snelling is a liar.
Let me unpack that for you. Even a simple cell is complex. You ask any microbiologist who looks down a microscope, and they will tell you that the cell, you can fit on the size of a pinpoint, is incredibly complex. In fact, one biologist said, the cell is as complex as a city the size of New York or London.
So far, this whole argument is just, gee whiz, ain't that neat, mister? Must have been a miracle. That's not an argument. Further, when did we jump to the origin of the eukaryotic cell? To explain the common ancestry of echinoderms, angiosperms, and vespids, we don't need to go nearly that far back. And remember, these were his examples of evolution. So even if it were true that the origin of the eukaryotic cell couldn't fit within an evolutionary paradigm, that doesn't mean that those organisms couldn't have had a common ancestor. And let's remember, if echinoderms and insects share common ancestry, then so do humans, dinosaurs, and insects, because we're closer to echinoderms than to insects.
Because it's got a brain, a control center, or a nucleus, it's got transport networks, it's got factories, it's got powerhouses, it's got all the ingredients that make up a mega city with all its complexity.
I was hoping he'd make an argument, but no. Here's a hint to creationists. Complexity per se is not an argument for design, because both design and evolution predict that organisms will be complex. And in fact, evolution would tend to predict that organisms may end up being more complex than necessary due to the fact that evolution can only tinker. It can't wipe the slate clean and come up with a simpler, more efficient design like an intelligent designer could. So any complexity that is past the minimum actually argues against design.
So what do we find in the fossil record? We go from life to complex life.
Right? Isn't that what we'd expect based on evolution? What's the argument here? Maybe he'll clarify in a bit.
Cells, fully formed, fully functioning, ready.
Maybe, maybe not. It's not clear how we'd identify a fossil protocell. or even if such a thing would be likely to fossilize in the first place. So it's not a surprise that the first organisms we see are the ones that 1. Can easily fossilize, and 2. We can recognize as fossils. That doesn't really say anything about what came before them. Plus, if he's talking about the Cambrian, then at best he's arguing for separate ancestry of the eukaryotic kingdom level taxa, which is way, way more common ancestry than he'd actually admit to. Basically, an argument that you're not related to a pine tree isn't an argument that you're not related to an elephant.
It's the same no matter what level we look at. These flatworms.
You mean Dickinsonia, one of the most primitive bilaterians in the fossil record, which may be transitional to segmented organisms like the panarthropods, and which are found in rocks too old to be flood rocks according to Snelling? Sure, what about them?
There's no hint of any ancestors in the layers below them. They appear suddenly in the fossil record, fully formed, fully complex.
I guess Icaria wariutia doesn't exist then. Oh wait, yes it does. It's an even more primitive bilaterian from some 10 to 50 million years before Dickinsonia. Ouch, that must feel bad for Snelling.
Like this trilobite. Most people think, well, that's 3 lobes. Trilobite, 3 lobes. It's got 3 sections to its body. By the way, you see it's got a head. That's the left-hand end. See those 2 knobs? That's the eyes of the trilobite. They've been fossilised.
Are we in for a pointless but reasonably accurate lesson on trilobite anatomy? I mean, that's better than blatant lies, so let's find out.
Our lenses, not these things that I have to wear, but inside here, the lenses in my eyes are made up of organic tissue. Not so the trilobite eyes. The lenses are made up of lime, the same mineral that's in limestone, calcite.
It's true that they are made of calcite, which interestingly ties back to the limestone that we already talked about. You see, in many, if not most limestone beds, the origin of the calcium carbonate is actually biological. It's the skeletons of dead plankton. And given that limestone formations can exceed 1,000 feet in thickness, they represent more plankton than could possibly have lived during the flood of Noah, because if they had been alive, they essentially would have been the floodwater. The ocean would just be a sludge of plankton, which would have prevented most of them from photosynthesizing.
And we can actually study the fossilised eye of the trilobite, and here it is. It's made up of multiple lenses, all focusing in different directions at the same time. Incredibly complex, so this creature could look in all directions and have everything in focus while he scurried across the ocean floor.
Okay, that's cool, but I really hope there's a point coming.
We, with our ingenuity, have only made similar lens systems in the last 50 years by intelligent input and design.
It's only in the last few decades that humans have been able to make artificial gems. Does that mean that gems had to be specifically intelligently designed by God? The inability of humans to reproduce a natural phenomenon does not imply that that phenomenon has no natural cause.
You know, it's like this. Millions of years of wind and water obviously carved out the president's head. You and I can all see the evidence of intelligent planning, design, and input.
Yeah, we don't see statues of humans without the signs of human activity like tool marks. Interestingly, we have yet to see a biological organism out in the wild with signs of human activity. But we do see evolution occurring all over the place. So in a situation where you have a no natural cause and no indication of any artificial interference, why would you just assume that it's not a natural phenomenon? I don't know, maybe lightning really is Thor's displeasure.
There was Stephen Hawking using a voice synthesizer to be able to communicate with us, built by intelligent engineers who designed it, and yet he used that system to tell us we all got here by chance.
Humans can't make a thing, therefore nature can't make other things. That's the argument. Non sequitur et mendax est, Snelling.
So what do the fossils show? Evidence of death, disease and destruction.
Yes.
Evidence of rapid burial.
Sometimes.
Evidence of sudden appearance.
No.
Evidence of design by an intelligent creator. We've just dealt with that.
He didn't deal with that at all. He asserted it based on the unargued for assumption that complexity requires design. But that does not follow. I wish I could have countered an argument about complexity implying design, but he simply failed to give one, and apparently is now just moving on.
And the evidence of no evolutionary transitions. You know, where are the missing links?
Well, I already showed some for the echinoderms, angiosperms, and hymenopterans, so, you know, they're right where we expect them to be.
That hypothetically link one type of creature to another. Like here, half a reptile, half a bird.
Hey look, it's Ornithomimus, and here comes Psittapati. And don't look now, but it's Archaeopteryx. Who's this next? It's Anchiornis. And what do you know? But I see a Microraptor.
By the way, Stephen Jay Gould recognised this problem. He was known to say he was arguably the greatest evolutionist of the 20th century, and he made this comment: what use is half a wing or half a jaw? Think about it.
I have thought about it. In fact, I'll link to my 15-minute video all about what good half a wing is. It turns out that if you're in an environment where extending your glide slope during a fall is good, then half a wing is really advantageous. That's why lots of animals like sugar gliders, colugos, flying frogs, flying fish, flying squirrels, etc. have half a wing. As for half a jaw, it's good for holding onto food while you use other appendages to move it to your mouth. I mean, that's not exactly rocket science.
A reptile that's on its way to becoming a bird, its legs are changing into wings.
Nope, those limbs were already arms that it wasn't walking on.
So when they're halfway there, they're not very good for running, and they're not very good for flying, so how does it survive?
They weren't being used for running, but for grasping, and the first bird wings were still good for grasping. Further, even the full wings of pterosaurs were good for running, as we have lots of pterosaur tracks that indicate that they were not clumsy on the ground, despite walking on their wings. So even if he were right about the transition going from leg to wings in birds, rather than from leg to arm to wing, so what? That apparently wasn't a problem for pterosaurs. Why would it be for birds? And while the earliest dinosaur wings weren't great for flying, they were okay at extending glide slope, which, as we know from modern extant animals, can provide an advantage in both avoiding predation and finding food and mates. All the while, the arm function isn't lost, because they can still grasp until so far into bird evolution that flight becomes the dominant mode of locomotion, and flight characteristics take precedence over grasping ability, and at which point the skull starts changing to have more cranial kinesis, so that the mouth can more finely manipulate food, and in the case of corvids, even tools. Because yeah, crows have technology.
Feathers are more than scales. They're totally different. A bird is more than feathers. A bird has a different lung system, has a different heart system, a circulation system. It's radically different from a reptile.
Feathers are more than scales, but they're not really all that different. They develop from the same proteins and via the same regulatory network as crocodile scales, but the signaling cascade is different. That is, the same genes in crocodiles form scales as form feathers in birds. They just express at different times. In fact, if you're careful, you can get an alligator to grow basic feathers as an embryo. As for different respiratory systems, we know that many dinosaurs, including those thought to be closest to birds, actually had the avian-style respiratory system. So it's still a question as to how dinosaurs got it, but it's not a question of relevance to the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs. As for the heart system, like their archosaur cousins, birds have four-chambered hearts, and while crocodilians now bypass one of the chambers, birds do not, indicating that again this probably goes all the way back to at least Archosauria, and it isn't a question of how birds evolved from dinosaurs. Basically, this is the same thing as arguing that because he doesn't know how hair could evolve from scales, that rats can't have evolved from mammals because they have hair. It's complete nonsense. And as for the hearts, basically they started as simple muscles. Then through simple infolding they gained valves that could lessen the mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Then the muscles around these new chambers started to be out of sync, further increasing efficiency. All of this is produced by simple changes in the embryonic development of whether cells are signaled to fold, grow, or die, which is all that happens at that stage of ontology. Cells fold, they grow, they die, or they do nothing. The four-chambered heart is not a barrier or problem for evolution. It's actually reasonably straightforward compared to some things.
And in the fossil record, whenever we find skeletons that look like birds, they are true birds.
Yeah, are they though? Because AIG's own David Menton seems to think that Velociraptor is a bird, but the Creation Museum, also run by Answers in Genesis, still presents it as a scaly dinosaur. So maybe it's not so clear.
Archaeopteryx was once said to be the ancestor of the birds.
Not really. Maybe very early on that was proposed, but it's not likely the ancestor of extant birds. Rather, it's an example of a morphological transition between basocelurosaurian dinosaurs and avian dinosaurs. Evolution predicts that we should find such transitions, whereas creationism merely accommodates them. But neither really requires any given transitional form to be directly ancestral to modern groups.
But we know it was a true bird with true feathers.
If having true feathers makes you a bird, then you're going to get a lot of dinosaurs that aren't too bird-like to be birds. I'm not really sure Snelling wants to say that Eutyrannus is a bird. Further, what's a true feather? Are the hair-like feathers of the kiwi or the cassowary true feathers? I don't know, because Snelling has yet to bother to tell us.
Yes, it had claws on its wings and it had teeth in its bill, but we've got living birds with claws on their wings and teeth in their bill.
First, Archaeopteryx had no bill or beak, which all living birds do. Second, yes, some living birds have claws. More than you probably realize, dear audience. But no living bird has teeth. Some have beak serrations, though.
Or this so-called transition from fish to amphibians, fins changing into legs. While the fins are partway fins, partway legs, Oh, it's also got to have the lung system, hasn't it, to breathe on air, on land as well as in the water. So it's got to change at the same time. What if it doesn't all change at the same time? The creature comes to a dead end and dies.
Man, if only lungs hadn't already evolved in fish from diverticulae of the digestive system, and then later on in some other fish, the same organ evolved into a swim bladder, while continuing to be lungs in organisms like tetrapods and the lungfish, which is, the extant sister group to tetrapods. And it's called a lungfish because it has these organs called lungs.
Just like it can't swim very well or walk very well.
Actually, it can swim very well with those robust neural arches in the tail supporting a flat and tall surface, much like that of a modern crocodilian. As for walking, well, it didn't really need to walk well. It probably just walked to get out of the water and avoid large, piscine predators. Once you're on land with nothing bigger than a scorpion to threaten you, as would be the case for the first tetrapods, you don't actually need to walk well to get to the next pond. Further, we can see modern fish who are not exactly efficient walkers, but who nonetheless manage to walk across land to get to new bodies of water. An example that comes to mind is the walking catfish, and I'll let you guess why they're called that. And here's a hint. It's not because they never leave the water.
Oh, by the way, they touted a missing link between these two. They called it Titilak.
Titilak? Did Titilak have a tibula, just like Australopithecus? It's Tiktaalik.
By the way, how many bones did they actually find? That's what they found. Can you see the evidence there of fins changing the legs? What was missing?
Yes, I can see the evidence of fins turning into legs, with the separation of the pectoral girdle from the cranium as well as the increased general robustness compared to other stegocephalians. And while I can't make it out in this fossil, and the paper The Pectoral Fin of Tiktaalik rosier and the Origin of the Tetrapod Limb did describe its internal fin anatomy. So what's missing is basically the back half, but of course it's only missing in that photo. The back half wasn't described until after the front portion, and so isn't always in photographs of the find. Let's see what Andrew thinks is missing, shall we?
The artist's imagination.
What? What is he talking about? I honestly have no clue what point he's trying to make here.
Because you see, when you find a whole skeleton, you can see the feet or you can see the fins. You don't see anything in between.
But that Tiktaalik specimen does have foot-like fins. They're just pressed against and under the body, so in the picture showing the fossil from above, you can't see them. This is just looking at a coin with the head side up and concluding that it doesn't have a tail side because you can't see it. We have reached flat earth levels of logic here. Like seriously, we are dealing with something that humans normally can figure out at about 8 months old. That just because you can't see something right now doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Of course, it also just might maybe be the case that Snelling is smarter than an 8-month-old infant, and is just a liar.
Oh, and by the way, they later found footprints of vertebrate animals below where they found Titilak.
Tiktaalik.
So they knew that
Tiktaalik
couldn't be the ancestor of the four-footed animals because there were already four-footed animals around.
Right, as is normal for even extant transitional species, like the pipefish, which is transitional between basal signathiformes and the highly derived seahorses. Basal forms like Tiktaalik can survive alongside more derived organisms, and we don't expect the transitional forms we find in the fossil record will actually be the literal ancestors of modern groups, rather than a morphological example of our predictions of the anatomy of such organisms.
And you'll often see these big announcements in the newspapers, missing link found. And about 2 months later, you'll find a little footnote where they've retracted it. They don't tell you when they retract it.
I'm going to need a citation for that one.
It's interesting to see what they actually say, the secular scientists. Here was Charles Darwin in 1859. In his book, On the Origin of Species, this is what he said in his chapter 10. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory.
Yep, and now we have numerous intermediate links, as Darwin called them. Turns out that we have discovered a lot of stuff since he wrote.
So he realised there were none of these missing links.
Well, not long after that, Archaeopteryx was found, so he got to see his ideas vindicated in that way before he died.
What was his explanation? The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. Well, in 1859, they hadn't explored most of the world.
Exactly. Well, humans had, but not the ones who were keeping careful notes about fossils. That was sort of a uniquely European idea at the time, although the Americans were catching up.
So we can excuse Charles Darwin. But what about today, when geologists and scientists have been in every corner of the globe? Has the picture changed at all?
Yeah, dramatically so.
Well, Stephen Jay Gould agrees with Charles Darwin when he said the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in inorganic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Did you get what he said?
Yep, he said that we didn't have many evolutionary intermediates for certain transitions. And then later, in the part Andrew didn't quote, that perhaps some changes happen more quickly than we thought. And he's at least partially right about that. And of course, in the 80 years since, we found many of the transitions he complained about being absent. This, of course, seems like as good a time as any to let Professor Hubert J. Farnsworth of Mars University give us an example of how talking about intermediate forms with creationists tends to go.
Dr. Banjo?
In the fur. And I remind you that evolution is merely a theory, like gravity or the shape of the Earth. If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus.
Yes, they have. It's called Homo habilis.
Aha! But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have. It's called Australopithecus africanus.
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius macilli?
Not only can't we find them, we can't even imagine what they look like.
Wow, Stephen Jay Gould got something kind of wrong 40 years ago. I honestly can't imagine how anyone thinks that's a good point.
David Raup at the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History at the University of Chicago, arguably the greatest paleontologist of the 20th century with the largest fossil collection in the world in that museum. He said this in 1979, well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerkily, ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Wait a minute, how many did Darwin have? None. We've got even fewer than that now. Boy, that isn't very convincing, is it?
No, 40-year-old quotes from some guy at a museum are not very convincing when compared to the actual transitional forms that we have, like Indo-Hyas or Proto-Siren.
Some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. And you know, Colin Patterson at the British Museum of Natural History agrees. He wrote a book on evolution and he was asked a question in a letter, and this is how he responded. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would have certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Wow. And you think that the museums are full of these missing links? No.
Oh hey, this one again. Okay, well I already covered this, so here's Dapper from the past. Yup, this is another quote mine. And one from a personal letter, so not something that is easily checked. Nevertheless, we are indebted to Lionel Thunison, sorry if I mispronounced that, for doing a whole lot of legwork on this one, including reading the revised book Evolution by Dr. Patterson, as well as trying to write to get the full text of the letter from the creationists publishing this quote. They refused to give it to him, which is contrary to academic standards of openness and honesty, so he eventually wrote to Dr. Patterson himself, who confirmed that he did not mean that there were no transitional fossils, instead simply that none of them could for sure be said to be ancestors of modern groups, rather than a side branch with no descendants. In fact, in the book itself, Patterson lists and talks about quite a few transitional fossils. He just doesn't make the claim that a particular fossil taxa is necessarily directly ancestral to any modern extant organisms. Further, this quote is inaccurate according to Dr. Patterson, who says it should be read, if I knew of any, fossil or living, for which an airtight case could be made. He included this part to indicate that we cannot be certain if a form is directly ancestral or not.
Even Ernst Mayr in 2001 wrote, given the fact of evolution, well, he believes it's a fact, no, it's only a theory.
If by fact we mean something so well evidenced to be true that to deny it would be perverse, which I think is a pretty decent definition for figuring out which things you can call facts, all modern scientific theories are facts. Is it not a fact that microbes cause some diseases? Because that's germ theory. Is it not a fact that gravity reaches out from massive particles to bend space-time and cause an apparent force of attraction between massive objects? Because that's the theory of universal gravitation. Is it not a fact that chemicals are composed of atoms and ions? Because that's atomic theory.
Not even a good one, because it's easily falsified, but they don't accept that.
What he means is that no one considers his lies to be a good falsification of a theory that continues to be supported thousands of times a day and keeps making useful predictions. I don't blame them. Although, yes, evolution could be easily falsified. Many hypothetical observations would do so. So far, we keep not observing them, and instead keep observing things that support the theory, including intermediary fossils.
But given evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to descendants, but this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series, gaps between the different sorts of organisms. Well, so what do the fossils show?
Of course there are gaps. The fossil record doesn't contain every species that ever lived, let alone every individual. But that's what you'd need to have no gaps. Do I need to play the Futurama clip again?
But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Macilli?
But either way, let's see what young Earth creationist Todd Wood has to say about that black beast of creationism, the Equid sequence. For years, and until now, most creationists have rejected the idea that the sequence from Hyracotherium all the way to Equus Capitolus could be something that really evolved, since that's way too much morphological change and would constitute a change in kind. I'd also like to point out that Hyracotherium was nearly identical to contemporary rhino ancestors, but that's just a little side thing that just happens to confirm a prediction of evolution. Todd Wood and his co-authors discovered that using the techniques of baraminology, by which creationists suppose that they can find the borders of created kinds, that all the fossil equids were in fact in the same kind and did evolve from one another in more or less the same way science says that they did. I will point out that the study included no non-equids, which is convenient, because something tells me that if you included all the known fossil and living, say, tapiromorphs, which would mean rhinos, tapirs, and their extinct relatives, you might just find that you can't really exclude them from the kind either. And so you just get Perissodactyl as one big kind, which would really be a lot of macroevolution to believe in, while still being an anti-evolutionist.
They show evidence of sudden appearance. We covered that, with no ancestors in the layers.
Nope.
Evidence of design by an intelligent creator.
Nope.
We've just seen evidence of no evolutionary transitions.
Nope again. It really is amazing how wrong one human can be.
Instead, we see evidence of many varieties of basic kinds reproducing after their kinds.
What is happening? No, he didn't. He didn't even try to make an argument. Maybe he will now. But this is the first time the idea of kinds being seen in the fossil record was brought up. Also, isn't this guy a geologist, not a biologist? Maybe he should talk about some rocks.
Why do I use the word kind? Because that's the biblical definition of the different units of life.
The word kind isn't a biblical definition. It's a biblical term for which there is no rigorous or scientifically useful definition.
The term species is a man-made term. It's not in the Bible.
Correct, and it's not really an objective thing either. It's simply the way that humans have decided is handy to refer to populations of organisms to avoid confusion. What are objective, though, under creation or evolution, are lineages. The question is how far back do these lineages go, and who belongs to which ones?
And evolutionists have this tree of life, which we showed you before, where they believe that the first cell replicated and diverged and life went in all different directions. There was only one tree of life.
That is the current consensus view, although multiple origins of life isn't impossible. Things like the highly conserved structure of the genetic code itself, as well as apparently deep homologies and shared metabolic pathways among all extant organisms, seem to indicate that universal common ancestry is more likely than life having a few separate origins without genetic relationship. That being said, presumably if we found alien life, it would not go back to any ancestor with Earth life. So even if universal common descent is true for Earth life, it's likely not necessarily a universal truth about all life in the universe.
Whereas the Bible says no, there was a whole orchard. When God created, he made this bird to reproduce after its kind, the dogs to reproduce after their kind, the horses to reproduce after their kind.
Cool. So any ways we can test that hypothesis? Because remember, the null hypothesis for common descent is separate descent. And we consistently fail to support that null hypothesis when we check. And every phylogenetic study is a test of that hypothesis.
And so the Bible speaks of many varieties within each created kind. And so that's why in the petting zoo we have here a zorse and a zonkey. Because zebras can mate with donkeys and horses. They're part of the horse kind.
Okay, but the Ark Encounter lists Canidae as a kind, and grey wolves can't breed with maned wolves or African painted dogs or foxes. So apparently breeding can put you in the same kind, but not breeding isn't enough to separate an animal from a kind, which means we have no proposed mechanism to actually know if two organisms are in the same kind or not, only that they are. For example, rhinos might be able to hybridize with rhinos and tapirs with tapirs, but they can't with each other. But since neither can grey wolves and foxes, how do we know if the kind is Tapiromorpha, the superfamily, or if it's at the family level? We can't use breeding and then from there know that tapiroids can't breed with equids, but that's not enough to know that they're in separate kinds. So maybe now we have Artiodactyla as the kind. But then, what about the even-toed ungulates like cows? Maybe that's the kind. See, no matter where you draw the line, it's arbitrary, since you have no way to say these two organisms are definitely in separate kinds.
The kind is probably at the family level, and it's illustrated in the Ark.
But like species, putting a taxon at the family level is arbitrary. Beetle families can include as much diversity as a whole order of mammals. What is a family? It's a group of similar genera. But how similar? There is no single one-size-fits-all, because the Linnaean ranks are not part of nature, they're a human convention. What do exist is clades, and they have no inherent ranking except within a single lineage, where they get bigger and bigger as you go back in time and back in ancestry. So while there is no such thing as a family-ranked taxon in a non-arbitrary way, the fact that Canidae is a clade of organisms with a common ancestor is objective. But similarly, it's also objective that they are in the clade Caniformes, along with the Arctoideans such as raccoons, bears, and seals. But further, they are also in the clade Carnivora, along with the felids and other feliform animals. So saying that kinds are at the family level is taking what is acknowledged to be the arbitrary word of man about what constitutes a family, and then just pretending that God would care about that, and just so happen to make organisms entirely along what humans would later accidentally identify as a family. This is a nonsensical position to take. But when you look at the kinds list put out by Answers in Genesis, guess what? It's almost entirely just a list of families, with very few exceptions.
There was probably only about 1,400 basic kinds that had to need to go on the Ark. And so that's not many animals to fit on the Ark after all. And you know it's a big boat because you've been down there and you've seen how big it is.
See, here he rather gives away the game. The reason AIG has selected the family level as the kind is that when you count up the kinds it gives, it shows a number that they find reasonable for fitting on the Ark, but that they think doesn't need more evolution than they're comfortable with after the flood. Of course, it already requires so much evolution that the whole idea is absurd anyway, but hey, there are no non-absurd ways to take the story of Noah literally the way young Earth creationists do.
And so when we get to the fossil record, what do we find? Trilobites are always trilobites. They don't change into something else. They're different shapes with different ornamentation, different sizes, but they're always trilobites.
And the vertebrates are always vertebrates. They come in different sizes like titanosaurs and hummingbirds, and different shapes like anacondas and buffalo, but gosh darn it, they always keep that backbone. Yeah, that's because in evolution you can't escape your ancestry, no matter how much divergence keeps happening. The tree can only grow new branches from the existing branches. It can't simply cut off branches and then let them grow disconnected from the rest of the tree. That's the idea of creationism.
Or brachiopods or lamp shells. They have different ribs, but they've got the same overall body plan. They look different from one another, but there's similarities in all their features.
Wow, just like all apes, humans included have similar features in their shoulders, tail, teeth, and skull. This is weird. It's almost like humans and other apes clearly evolved from a common ape ancestor. And what do you know? They also share all the traits of mammals. So I guess all mammals evolved from a common mammal ancestor. And the mammals all share the traits of amniotes along with the reptiles. So I guess they all evolved from a common ancestor. Yeah, and guess what? Humans are still amniotes. They didn't stop being amniotes, nor could they. Similarly, evolution precludes brachiopods from ceasing to be brachiopods. Their descendants are and ever shall be brachiopods, because that's how ancestry works.
We see evidence of many varieties of basic kinds, but reproducing after their kinds in the fossil record.
No, because in order to see that, we need a rigorous definition of kind, and pointing out that the fossils obey the rules of evolution isn't a strike against evolution. And that's all he's done so far to argue for kinds.
And we also see that once a creature appears in the fossil record, it stays the same.
Let's look at Hyracotherium and E-Cabalus, which I will remind you have, according to creationists, been determined to be in the same kind. These don't look like they've stayed the same, and remember, the whole equid fossil sequence is found in post-flood rocks, so I'm pretty sure that the only reasonable conclusion is that Noah took some Hyracotherium on the Ark, and they evolved into modern one-toed equids. That's quite a lot of change. Far more change than from the presumed common ancestor of genus Pan and Homo.
It was Stephen Gould who coined the word stasis. It means staying the same.
Okay, stoppage of circulation. 1745, from medical Latin, from Greek stasis, standing still, standing, the posture of standing, a position, a point of the compass, position, state, or condition of anything. Also, a party, a company, a sect, especially one for seditious purposes. Related to statos, place, verbal adjective of histemi, cause to stand, from the Proto-Indo-European root sta, to stand, make, or be firm. So unless Gould time traveled back to the 18th century and became a medical doctor, no, he didn't coin the word stasis. He just applied it to evolutionary biology. And can I point out, it makes no difference if Gould coined that word, so Snelling is just wrong for no reason.
Let me give you some examples. Go to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and we see there in the Grand Canyon these huge mound-looking things, these dome things. The technical term is stromatolite. What are they? Well, they're mats, fossilized mats of slime that lived on the ocean in the intertidal zone near the beach. When the water comes in, the sand grains go over the mat, and the mat grows up on the sand grains and binds the sand grains together. And then the next tide brings in more sand grains. It keeps up piling up and growing these domes. How do we know that? Because the same slime is doing exactly the same thing in today.
Wait, so the present is the key to the past, and watching current phenomena produce geological structures can tell us how the same structures were produced in the past? Well, good to know Snelling is an actual geologist, so he can't simply come back with the "were you there?" because he was there to see modern stromatolites, and we're here to see other modern geological processes.
In Shark Bay in Western Australia. Exactly the same as back there in the Grand Canyon. Oh, they're supposed to be 1 billion years old, hasn't changed.
Say it with me now. Evolution doesn't require gross morphological change of a particular lineage over any particular timescale on its own. Organisms well adapted to their niche and environment are under stabilizing selection, and so will remain similar in morphology. Maybe it's worth time here to go into the 3 major kinds of selection pressure: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. Stabilizing selection occurs when a population is extremely well adapted to its current lifestyle and environment, and that environment is stable. We can see this in many groups of organisms colloquially called living fossils. While they are rarely completely identical to fossil members of the same group, it is obvious that they are extremely similar and have had little change over the course of the history of life. An example might be Xiphosurans, the horseshoe crabs. Modern horseshoe crabs all fall into the single family Limulidae, but there were other families in the past. However, even so, they all look very much like modern horseshoe crabs, and with good reason. Limulids are considered a living fossil. Next, let's look at directional selection, in which some change in a feature of an organism is consistently selected for, and so the organism keeps evolving in a particular direction. In other words, selection is consistently for a more extreme phenotype. For this, let's look back at the equids, which overall show a trend towards digit reduction and leg lengthening as an adaptation for greater speed, as well as a general increase in size. This means that generally, bigger, faster horses consistently did better than smaller, slower ones for basically all the time horses have existed. Now that's a simplification, but not a grossly inaccurate one. Disruptive selection means that 2 extremes of a trait are both favored for different reasons, and so the population starts to diverge into 2 different varieties. This occurs in Sepia apama, the giant cuttlefish of Australia. Some males are much larger than females and will establish a territory which they vigorously defend and will use that to attract females. But another and genetically distinct form of male is about the same size as a typical female and will mimic one in order to sneak into the larger male's territory and mate with the females there. In this case, both strategies lead to success, whereas mid-sized males have trouble sneaking or getting territory. So there is selection pressure for male A. apama to be either as large as they can or to stay as small as a female, but really no pressure for them to be at an intermediate size. Snelling here is basically just complaining that stabilizing selection is a thing, as we would expect, and that in some cases it can persist for hundreds of millions of years. That's not really an objection.
Or look at this brachiopod. Moreton Bay, Brisbane, Australia, where Ken and I came from. And you can see this clam or brachiopod lamp shell.
Brachiopods are not at all clams. Now, they are cryptotropozoans, which is the sister group to mollusks, so they're not exactly the farthest thing, but they're far more different than a human and a carp. There is no excuse for someone purporting to be a science educator to get this wrong.
On the shores of Moreton Bay today. You can go back in the fossil record over 500 million years. One of the earliest brachiopods is the same lingula. It hasn't changed. It's exactly the same. You identify it exactly the same.
Well, no, it's not exactly the same. No fossil taxon is. But yeah, stabilizing selection is a thing, and evolution doesn't require things to go extinct.
Or you can see this fossil fish in the fossil record called the coelacanth. Supposed to have died out 65 million years ago.
Let me guess. Snelling is going to show two very different coelacanths, that fossil and that taxidermy mount, and then say that they are exactly the same, even though they obviously are not. Let's find out.
Until 1938, we found it living off the coast of Madagascar. We've even videotaped it swimming off Japan and off Indonesia.
I guess not, which is good. But then, why even bother? I wonder if Snelling knows that he's a mammal, and that mammals have been around for a long time too, and yet you still find them alive today. Oh my goodness, evolution wrecked! He then goes on to talk about the Wollemi pine, ginkgo trees, crabs, crayfish, and beetles. I'm cutting until he gets to a new point. Of course, he's wrong that none of these things have changed, but who cares?
And we find evidence of rapid mass destruction and burial on a global scale in the flood. Yes?
No, because the catastrophic burial we do see in the fossil record is not all caused by floods, nor is it globally correlated, so it can't have all been a single event. And further, it's between decidedly non-catastrophically created and still fossil-bearing strata.
We don't find the fossils as individuals, we find them en masse.
No, not all fossils are in fossil graveyards. Some of them are indeed relatively isolated. In fact, an isolated fragmentary fossil describes most fossils.
If you don't believe me, go off the 275 into one of those road cuts, and that's exactly what the limestones, the hard layers that you'll find in all the road cuts around Cincinnati, full of corals, clams, brachiopods, and crinoids, all broken up and smashed up, bryozoans.
So the argument is, if you don't believe me that all examples of X are Y, go look at this example of X that is Y. That proves it. In other words, if you don't believe me that all swans are white, go look at a white swan. That is not how logic works, sir.
The limestones are jam-packed with all the broken remains of these creatures everywhere you look around this area. The museum is built on a fossil graveyard.
Yep, fossil graveyards exist. They're really cool and a good spot for a museum about said graveyard. He then gives examples of fossil beds, which, yeah, they exist. I'm not going to include his laundry list. But I will point out that he uses a limestone fossil bed as an example. And as I already covered, limestone cannot be laid down in a flood. But towards the end of this ramble, he does ask a good question about a fossil site in Tasmania.
And in this fossil deposit, we find the remains of a toothed whale that lives in the deep ocean and a marsupial possum that lives on the land. When do you see whales and possums living together, by the way?
You don't, but you do see them dying together if a possum gets washed into a river after it dies. Which, isn't exactly a far-fetched thing to happen. Also, it can happen if a possum is swept out to sea by a storm.
We'd actually extract observation from interpretation. When we see fossils, do we know that's where they died?
No, we know that's often not where they died, hence the possum and the whale being together. Post-mortem transport is incredibly common in the fossil record. But in some cases we do know where an organism died, as we have examples of fossils preserved with the fossil tracks that organism made on its way to where we now find it.
No. Do we know where that's where they lived? No.
Well, we know they had to live close enough to be transported there post-mortem, so, we know what the field of options are for where the organism died.
One thing we know is that's where they died where they buried because we observed them buried in the rocks in that location.
Nope, you can know a lot more in some cases.
So how do you get a whale and possum that didn't live together to be buried together?
Rivers, floods, landslides, and storms, the existence of which is well understood in science and not indicative of a global watery catastrophe. And let's remember, these fossils are Cenozoic, and AIG says that means post-flood, so these aren't flood fossils. And I want to be very clear, when I say that AIG says that these are post-flood, I mean specifically that Andrew Snelling, our speaker here, published a paper in Volume 8 of the Proceedings of the International Conference of Creationism called Locating the Flood Post-Flood Boundary Using the Relative Dating of Weathering of Ore Deposits in 2018, in which he concluded that the KPG boundary, typically dated in real science to 66 million years old, is the flood boundary. So when he explains these fossils as caused by the flood of Noah, he is knowingly lying to you, because he knows that's not his position, but it's convenient if his audience doesn't know that.
The ocean covered the land.
After the flood. Remember that. If this is a marine deposit, and it is, he needs post-flood seas on what is now land in Tasmania.
Oh, here's a fossil deposit in southern Israel. See the Boyfa scale up there on the top right? Let's zoom in. What do we see? All these coiled ammonite fossils.
I don't know what the argument is. Amniote fossils exist. Yeah, we know.
Many of you are familiar with the chalk cliffs of the White Cliffs of Dover, the English Channel.
Yeah, 350 solid feet of fossil plankton skeletons that had to be deposited in non-acidic, calm, warm oceans over the course of, at the very least, more than 2,000 years. I'm familiar with them.
Made up of chalk, a type of limestone. Under the microscope, you can see trillions, literally trillions of microscopic shellfish.
Exactly. Too many to have been alive at one time. I guess he's just going to do my job for me and then pretend he didn't.
But this is a mass graveyard of ginormous proportions.
Nope, because limestone cannot deposit quickly, because that's physically impossible. It is, in fact, the record of death of more organisms over a long time than could possibly have lived at once.
We see evidence of rapid mass destruction and burial on a global scale in a catastrophe, the flood. All around the world, every continent is covered with these layers containing all these fossils en masse buried.
At best, one of the layers we were shown could be well explained by catastrophe, and that one was post-flood according to Snelling himself. That's not even evidence on his own terms. Do you see why I think that Andrew Snelling is just the worst kind of liar? He knows better even according to the so-called research he publishes in creationist journals.
What about the order of the fossils? Well, the order of the fossils in the rock layers, therefore, must be the burial order of the flood.
I'd agree. If there were a global flood, then the lowest fossils should be the first ones buried. So let's see if what we see in the fossil record is what we'd expect to see if the organisms were all buried in a single flood.
And that makes a lot of good sense. Why? Well, if we go to the Grand Canyon again to these stromatolites, they're in the layers below the flood rocks. And so we're not surprised to find that some of these domes are stacked up in a linear structure that looks like a reef. That there might have been a reef system made of these slime mats building these domes that protected a lagoon near the coast of the pre-flood continent. And when the flood came, it buried that reef. And it buried the creatures that were in the lagoon before the waters rose up to cover the land. Why do I say that?
Okay, except that Ediacaran fossils tend to be deep-water marine fossils. In fact, we know that Charnia, one of the most famous and most mysterious Ediacaran fossils, was benthic. So it should be buried long before shallow water stromatolites, but that's not what we find. So at step one, we've already lost the plot.
Well, where does the Bible say the flood began? The fountains of the great deep broke open. The great deep was the ocean. So the flood began in the ocean when the ocean floor got ripped apart and water started coming out with hot molten rock. You know, 70% and more that comes out of a volcano is water in the form of steam. So if the flood began in the oceans, which animals would get affected first by the flood? The creatures that lived on the ocean floor. So jellyfish and fossil flatworms, for example.
But jellyfish don't live on the ocean floor. They swim in the water column. I was in the Navy. I saw a lot of jellyfish right at the top of the ocean. And further, we know that according to Snelling, it affected shallow reefs first, and then things in even shallower coastal water second. I guess just skipping over the deep water.
And what I want to show you, and this is depicted in the flood geology room in the museum, just down this way. If you've been there, if you haven't, go there and look at our Allosaurus fossil, and also you'll see this diagram here. The horizontal sequence of rock layers with the fossils in them, the order of the fossils in that vertical sequence, represents the horizontal progression of the flood. As the waters rose over the ocean, what did they do? They first all affected the creatures on the seafloor, on the shallow seafloor, the trilobites, the brachiopods. They couldn't easily escape. Corals are fixed to the ocean floor, so they can't escape.
Okay, but we have benthic trilobite species with no eyes. Why aren't they lower than the shallow water stromatolites? And why do trilobites persist throughout the Paleozoic, even higher than some land animals? See, this isn't going well for him.
By the way, most people don't realise that 95% by volume and number of the fossils are the shallow water marine creatures, the shellfish, the corals, the clams. 95%!
So I have never managed to find a good source for this. Best I can find is that Dwayne T. Gish mentioned it in a conversation as an offhand estimate. Not exactly rigorous scholarship, even by creationist standards. I don't know that a study has ever been done on this topic. I certainly haven't found one.
Now, to put that in perspective, less than 5% represents the plants, fossil plants.
Again, this apparently just comes from off-the-cuff estimates from Dwayne Gish, former head of the Institute for Creation Research.
And fossil plants, a good example of those that are found in the coal, C-O-A-L. You know that black stuff they dig up to burn in a power station? Coal.
Does he think that his audience doesn't know what coal is? I mean, he must think they're morons to be lying this much and this obviously. But way to say the quiet part's loud, my dude.
That's fossil plants. In the United States alone, there is believed to be 7 trillion tonnes of coal.
And here we have an example of creationists finding big numbers amazing. It's like when Kent Hovind's audience laughed when told about how many stars are in the observable universe. I guess when your view of the world is that it's only 6,000 years old, numbers like trillion do seem incredible just for being big numbers.
And that's fossil plants that represent less than 5% of the fossil record. It tells you how many orders of magnitude more of these shallow water marine creatures.
We have a lot of marine fossils. Water covers most of the Earth. Almost all of it is ocean water. Water is where most sedimentation occurs, and at various times in the past, the oceans have been much higher. So areas now above water were underwater, and also parts of the ocean have been uplifted. This is what we would expect.
And when we look at the fossil record, what do we find? We find marine fossils throughout the record.
Yeah, which is kind of a problem, since under marine deposits, you can also find things like desert deposits. So I wonder what he's going to say next.
Yes, some became extinct, but many survived all the way through the flood.
That doesn't explain how they ended up at all heights. Were they just able to avoid the catastrophe that managed to lay down, in some areas, more than a mile of sediment? That seems, far-fetched. And apparently they also got caught in tsunamis or something that washed up the land animals, but only conveniently in patterns that match what we would already predict based on evolutionary biology.
They didn't have to go on the ark, by the way, because they could live in the water.
Then why did so many of them go extinct? Why did lobsters only get buried later and survive longer than the trilobites, despite having basically the same habitat?
It was only the land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures that had gone onto the ark, because all the land was going to be covered by water. There'd be nowhere for them to live.
As if violent flooding mixing all the fresh and salt water that results in thousands of feet of sedimentation is something that water creatures will be just fine with. And that's ignoring the heat problem that Snelling has no answer for. The idea that aquatic life would be fine in a global flood basically only makes sense if you just never think about it.
And there's evidence that on the pre-flood oceans, there was a floating forest. It's depicted in our flood geology room with a diorama. That is hollow plants, hollow trunks with hollow roots that couldn't live on land in soil because the roots weren't strong enough to penetrate soil, actually formed a tangled mass of roots in which there was organic debris that were like floating islands of vegetation in the pre-flood world. And when they got beached as a result of the flood, they formed the coal beds in West Virginia, Pennsylvania.
Okay, so these coal beds are carboniferous, and he even has in situ pictures of these plants. Now, he states that these plants were floating because they couldn't live in soil. Oh man, too bad all these carboniferous rock layers preserve numerous soil horizons with preserved paleosols. So we know for a fact that they did grow in soil. Darn it, Snelling was foiled again by literally the top page of Google Scholar.
And then as the floodwaters conquer the land, we find the land animals start to be preserved. The vertebrates become increasingly fossilized.
Except there are fully terrestrial animals preserved in the Carboniferous too, so I guess let's scratch that bit of supposed evidence off. At some point, I'd like him to say something about the fossil record that's true beyond just correctly identifying the broad group of organisms to which a fossil belongs. And even there, he's not always right.
And interestingly, we only find dinosaurs buried with naked seed plants.
Incorrect. Starting with the early Cretaceous, we find dinosaurs buried with fruiting and flowering plants. I've already gone over this earlier in the series, so I won't rehash it here.
They make a lot about dinosaurs, but there's probably only about 50 or 60 varieties of dinosaurs, families.
Again, family is an arbitrary term. It doesn't correspond to a real thing, besides the fact that ideally, they are all at least real clades, but they can't be compared across taxa.
As we go higher up, probably in altitude, we actually come to the mammals and angiosperms, the flowering plants. What am I saying in altitude? I'm saying as the waters progressively rose up onto the land. Think about it.
Okay, I'm thinking about all those coastal Cenozoic inland seas like the Tethys Sea, surrounded by lowland lacustrine and fluvial rocks, that completely BTFO this argument. And let's not forget that true mammals are around from the mid-Jurassic on, and things you would definitely call a mammal if you saw them, from the late Triassic on. So apparently these things are also living in the lowlands. I don't know, this whole idea of elevation-based sorting just doesn't work.
If you go to the Grand Canyon today, at the rim, at a high altitude, you've got ponderosa pine and deer. At the bottom of the Grand Canyon, a mile down, you've got cacti and bighorn sheep.
So mammals in both cases. And there are definitely cacti at the top of the canyon. I was just there, and I saw them. There were barrel cacti and prickly pear.
So if you flood the Grand Canyon, you get cacti and bighorn sheep fossilised together, but you get ponderosa pine and deer up here higher up. Buried higher up.
Yeah, if the flood doesn't reach the top, but if it did, they'd all get swept downhill together and be more sorted by size and density, which is what we see in actual flood deposits, including with the fossils therein. We get graded bedding, which characterizes none of the rocks this geologist has mentioned so far.
By the way, did you realise that the Bible tells us the Garden of Eden was at a high elevation? Yeah, it does, because water flows downhill and the river flowed out of Eden. So Eden had to be at a high elevation. See, isn't it interesting? You've got to read the Bible carefully.
I would like to introduce you to the city of Alexandria, Louisiana, population 47,000, elevation 75 feet or 23 meters, and out of which flows a river, in particular, the Red River. Turns out a river can flow out of your area even if you're in low elevation, if it starts higher up. I don't even know why I care, it's just that what Snelling said was dumb and I want to point it out.
And mammals and flowering plants are only found together in the fossil record, which means they primarily live together in a separate community from the dinosaurs. The Garden of Eden had fruit trees for Adam and Eve to eat fruit. The animals that he named were probably mammals. So, the burial order, the order in the fossil record represents the burial order of the flood.
Nope. Mammals predate flowering plants by about 70 million years, give or take a few million years. So even if we ignore these ages, we know Snelling is full of it, because he at least accepts the relative dating and knows or should know that mammals are found with dinosaurs earlier than flowering plants.
We find trace fossils in the fossil record, like these worm burrows where the worm was going down and suddenly realised that the sediment was covering it up, so it did a U-turn.
You know what floods do? They erase ichnofossils. Ichnofossils being things like burrows, tracks, etc. Fossils made by organisms, but not made of organisms. You see a worm burrow, you know it's not a flood deposit. And hey, you know what many worms do? Make U-shaped burrows, even today. In fact, characteristically, priapulid worms, or penis worms as they are called, make U-shaped burrows so that one end can catch food and the other expel waste.
We call them escape burrows. We find all their trails.
You call them escape burrows. What real scientists call them is proof you're not dealing with a flood deposit, because floods rework any sediment disturbed by organisms. Because remember, according to Andy here, the flood is a violent catastrophic event with sediment being deposited thousands of times faster than the laws of physics will allow. But hey, why not say it can also preserve delicate trace fossils like worm tracks?
And we even find the trails of trilobites. But the interesting thing is, the trails of the trilobites were fossilised millions of years before the trilobites were fossilised. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. You see, in a lifetime, an organism can make many more tracks than it can dead bodies, or even cast-off shells. As a result of this, and how rare actual fossils are, it's not surprising that we would see the tracks of various organisms before we actually get their bodies. Further, trilobite shells first appear in the Cambrian, along with basically all other hard-bodied fossils. This is thought to be the result of the rise of predation in the environment. So before there were hard-bodied trilobites, their soft-bodied ancestors would still have been walking around, far less likely to leave a fossil.
Does that make sense? No, it doesn't.
You get a citation for that because not only does it make sense, a flood wouldn't preserve the tracks, since you know what happens when a bunch of sediment lands on a bunch of other sediment with tracks? You just get a bunch of sediment with no tracks. The sediment with tracks has to take time to dry out and at least partially lithify or turn to rock before new sediment arrives, or you can't preserve the tracks. Pray tell, how can this happen when sediment is depositing faster than it even can?
But if it was during the flood, it would scurry along the ocean floor trying to escape being buried, leave behind its prints, and then get buried above where it left its prints.
Sure, and then the prints would be erased.
And we see that pattern in the fossil record. We find the footprints of birds before we find bird fossils. We find the footprints of dinosaurs before we find dinosaur fossils. Here are fossilised amphibian footprints in the Grand Canyon, but we only find the animals that made it 50 million years later higher up in the record.
Yep, as expected by evolution. But again, every time he shows us ichnofossils, we know for that reason alone that this wasn't a flood deposit. Also, those amphibian tracks are from the Coconino Sandstone, a desert deposit, which Snelling pretends is actually a marine deposit by, get this, lying about it. He reports numbers no one else can for the slope of crossbedding in the Coconino. That probably deserves some basic explanation. You see, crossbedding is when we can see deposition lines that are not parallel, hence the word cross. Well, one of the things that causes this is sand dunes in sand that's going to become sandstone. Now, there are dunes both above and below the water, although I'll note that floods rework sand deposits to erase crossbedding in unconsolidated sand, meaning that even if Snelling were not lying, the Coconino still couldn't be flood rock, but that's neither here nor there. Without going into too much detail, the angle of the sides of sand dunes is different in water and in air. Snelling reports angles characteristic of underwater sand dunes. Everyone else who checks reports angles characteristic of sand dunes above water on land. He has yet to provide an adequate explanation for this, simply asserting that he knows where to look better than other people. You see why this guy got banned from doing field research in the Grand Canyon after lying about his collection locations and techniques? Too bad for us, he cried religious persecution loud enough to be allowed back in to do more fraudulent sample collection.
That doesn't make any sense at all. Or dinosaurs, like these footprints. Or what about these so-called egg nests of dinosaurs?
What about them? Other than the fact that you don't make footprints in a flood, as discussed, and animals tend not to make nests underwater in a flood either.
By the way, has anyone seen a dinosaur make a nest to lay eggs?
Yes, it happened in my yard this past year.
Strange that, isn't it?
What, it's strange that an animal that lays eggs would make a nest? No, that's almost universal among egg-laying amniotes. What's strange is that they would bother to do it while being buried alive by flood sediment.
You see, the scientists see a pile of eggs together like this and call it a nest. No. Let's think about it in terms of the flood.
Before we do that, let's take a look at some dinosaur nests. See how they're nice and geometric with the eggs arranged evenly spaced? What else would you call this but a nest? In fact, we even have a fossil of a dinosaur brooding on its nest, which not only further demonstrates that yes, this is a nest, but also that the animal had bird-like feathers, as otherwise this posture wouldn't actually have incubated many of the eggs between the forelimbs and the body.
The waters progressively rose from the ocean basins to cover the land. But during the flood, the water level continued to fluctuate daily. Why? Because there were tides. We had a global ocean. The tides would have been larger than the tides we experience today because there was no land to impede the water.
So what? Dinosaurs rushed downhill at low tide to lay eggs on the devastated beach?
And then you had earthquakes. What do earthquakes generate? Tsunamis.
And they generate seismite. And tsunamis generate tsunamite. And you know what these nests aren't preserved in? That's right, seismite or tsunamite.
We saw that off the coast of Japan when there was an earthquake. What happened? The tsunami came and wiped out the coastal communities. You saw that in March 2011 in real time on our TV screens.
Okay, I'm not going to sit here and make light of that tragedy. And it wasn't just Japan. Huge swaths of the Pacific and Indian Ocean were devastated and thousands lost their lives. But what do you think happened to any eggs laying about when the giant wall of water hit them? I bet they didn't stay in nice little circles.
The ocean basins broke up, these tsunamis rushed to the land, you got the tides. The water levels would have fluctuated by hundreds of feet during the flood. So, Animals like dinosaurs would get picked up by a surge and would swim around till the water level dropped. There's mum with the eggs ready to lay. She's got nowhere to lay them. She's swimming around. Then suddenly the water level drops. She can walk on a temporary surface, so she leaves her footprints, and she dumps her egg in a hurry and all in one spot. The water rises and she's swept away. The mud covers the footprints and the eggs. And then she gets buried finally because she runs out of breath in the layers above.
So she hurriedly dumps her eggs in a neat pattern in unconsolidated mud. Then a tsunami hits her, dropping a bunch more mud, but somehow preserving her prints in the mud and her eggs in their neat geometric pattern. Yeah, I'm going to press X to doubt on that one.
See how easy it is to explain in terms of the rapid succession of activities during the flood with the water levels fluctuating and surging?
No, I really don't, because that flies in the face of all logic, physics, and biology.
Well, lastly, what do the rock layers show? Well, they show that the ocean waters flooded over the continents. How do I know that? Because there are marine fossils in rock layers covering the continents.
Yeah, and shallow water deposits requiring calm seas, and you have places like Colorado, where evidently the sea came and went more than once throughout geological time. Good luck with that under a flood.
That's right. Marine fossils. Wouldn't you expect if they were marine that creatures lived in the ocean, they'd buried in the ocean?
Yes, I would, and they were. As it turns out, we know that even during historical times, the ocean is now in places it wasn't always, and there is land in places that there used to be no land.
Well, why are they buried up on the continents?
Parts of what are now the continents were under ocean water when the global temperatures were high enough to preclude permanent ice caps.
They had to get transported, lifted up by the floodwaters and dumped up on the continents.
Survey says, it's like he can't even comprehend there are non-insane options for all of this. Or rather, he can comprehend it, he just doesn't like it, so he lies about it.
And wouldn't you and I expect to find widespread, rapidly deposited rock layers because the flood was a global and it went all around the Earth? Yes.
But since they're the wrong kind of rocks for a flood, but the right kind of rocks for a sea transgression, and the sea transgression would be extensive, we have right there good reason to expect extensive rock layers that can be correlated even in very distant locations.
We find rock layers that can be traced all the way across continents and even between continents.
As if large swaths of the low-lying part of continental crust were covered in shallow seas when there were no ice caps.
Let me give you examples. The Tapete sandstone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's the first layer of the flood. It sits on that erosion surface that marks the beginning of the flood. There we can see it. That's the view from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. That little cliff at the bottom there sitting on top of an erosion surface. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. We can study its characteristics. You know what? We can trace that sandstone in outcrop and in drill holes all the way across North America, across to Greenland. You can go to Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin and you can see exactly the same sandstone with exactly the same features sitting on exactly the same erosion surface, sitting on the same crystalline basement. You can see it on a road cut in Missouri as well, in between. The same sandstone can be traced right across North Africa, right over to southern Israel, at Timnah. You've got the same sandstone with the same fossils, the same features, with the same erosion surface sitting on the same crystalline basement.
Just to remind everyone, extensive deposition is expected. And the fact it goes across continents is expected given that during the time of deposition, all the continents were joined into Pangaea. And further, that Tapetes isn't flood rock. Because of course it's not. It's fine-grained sandstone with herringbone crossbedding caused by years and years of tidal action working on sandbars in relatively calm water.
Only a global flood would do that.
No.
He then makes the same argument about the Redwall limestone and the White Cliffs of Dover. This even more couldn't be a flood deposit, and it's extensive for the same reason.
What other fossils are buried in the chalk beds? Well, if we go to the Niobrara chalk in Kansas, we find it's full of crinoids, perfectly formed crinoids that had to be catastrophically buried.
Kinda. Large-scale fossils like this result from underwater landslides in lime beds, and we can see characteristic signs of this. But limestone can't precipitate in the first place under flood conditions.
Or this fish didn't get time to digest its food. You see the size of that fish? It's 12 foot long. Would you bury that a quarter of an inch every 1,000 years, a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years?
No, it would deposit bedding a quarter of an inch every 1,000 years, then have the occasional slump of some of that sediment onto other sediment lower down, bringing with it any corpses, and leaving behind evidence of said slump.
The fish would have digested itself and swam away, wouldn't it?
Excuse me, the did you just say?
The fish would digest itself and swim away, despite being dead? I have no idea what to say. That's not a coherent thought there.
Or in the same chalk bed, you've got pliosaur fossils and turtle fossils 10 and 12 feet long across. You've got dinosaur fossils and bird fossils in the same chalk beds.
Well, now he's just lying. For example, Archelon, that turtle is not found in the chalk beds, but rather in shale. Of course, he doesn't bother citing what specimens there are, so I can't check on them. But given that the one that was easiest to check on wasn't even from chalk beds, I honestly don't feel like spending the rest of my day hunting down various unlabeled museum mounts to find out where the finds they are based on were made, given that we already know that Snelling has lied about one of them. Let's be clear here. This talk alone would be enough to get Andrew Snelling expelled from any academic institution of any repute. Or, if he had tenure, to ensure that he was never taken seriously again. And to be fair, no scientists do take him seriously, just young Earth LARPers.
Is the rock and fossil sequence real? Yes, we've learnt that today. Is it simply contrived to make it support evolution in millions of years? No, it's real. Does it show any evolutionary development of life in the geologic column? No, no, no.
Saying something 3 times doesn't make you less wrong.
Do the fossils date the rocks as millions of years according to the geological timescale? No, no, no. The fossils don't have labels on them high on millions of years old. They're just fossils.
But igneous rocks that can correlate to these fossils can be dated, and we don't need a label to do it. We have this great thing called radiometric dating, which basically relies on this other thing called physics. So as long as physics works, we can date igneous rocks.
Do we find marine creatures buried and fossilised on the continents? Yes, yes, yes. Were the creatures buried rapidly and thus the rock layers formed rapidly? Yes, yes, yes.
Nope. As we've seen in this series, and as I've referenced in my sources and linked videos, basically all the rocks we've discussed so far cannot be flood deposits.
Do some rock layers have a global extent? Yes, yes. Are the rock layers and fossils consistent with a global flood? Yes, indeed.
No. After this, he just starts preaching, and then comes the Ken Ham book commercial. I don't care about that, so I want to thank you very much for watching, and please do hit the like button if you liked this video, and hit the dislike button if you didn't like it. Make sure you leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. When you subscribe, remember to turn on all notifications so you're always alerted when there's new Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank my channel members and my patrons on Patreon. They really help keep the lights on here, and I want to thank those pledging $20 or above, especially Bob Knob, Benthoven, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. Without the support of those whose names you see on screen right now, the channel simply wouldn't exist as it does now, and I certainly wouldn't be able to do 2 to 3 videos a week for over a year and a half now. If you would like to help support and make it so that this channel is something that can keep going, there is a link to join below the video, as well as a link to the Patreon in the channel description. If pledging money isn't right for you, please just hit like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and share my videos. That really helps my channel grow. Let's read Genesis 2:19 and 20, shall we?
Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. But for Adam no suitable helper was found.